This is what I think a consequence
regime ought to look like, and I've just discovered, because I stayed over with a friend of mine at Oxford who's an economist, and he was about to talk to the water regulator actually about incentives and so on. This, I think, is sort of, if you like, the constitution for what a consequences regime ought to look like. Stable and predictable. It ought to reflect the outcome regime. It won't do any work as a management tool if it doesn't hang around for some time, and if I don't know in advance what the consequence, can't predict reliably in advance what the consequences will be. Sharon Shoesmith could not have predicted what happened to her. Therefore, it can't work as a management tool. It has a perverse effect of driving people into extreme risk aversion. It should be proportionate. I should be punished proportionate to the seriousness, the agreed seriousness in advance of what it is that I was doing. It should be corrective. The objective is to learn from what worked and what didn't. That's the point of the exercise, not to punish or to hurt. It should be systemic rather than heroic. We shouldn't praise and laud individual heroes, the chief executive, nor should we single them out. These are almost always collective endeavours, and we should be seeking to incentivise the collective, not just individuals, for good or ill. Timely. It ought to be applied in a relevant time frame, not 7 years after the event. People have moved on. It only works if it's, for good or ill, working within a relatively short period of time. And it ought to be pragmatic. It ought to be directed to improving services rather than inflicting punishment. My favourite story about this, I like, some of you will have noticed from last time, I like Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was actually quite sophisticated in his understanding of management systems. And this is him in his first story where where Mowgli is included, called In the Ruck. It's a short story about the forestry service, and the forestry service in India was set up by Germans, the first three, and the rest of the empire borrowed their forestry service precedent from India. So we in Australia borrowed from the Indian civil service, and he writes about Mullah. It was a particular individual that Kipling knew, and Mullah's theory was he would turn up at a forestry camp in the middle of the night and spend a few days with the person, studying what they're doing, giving them a bit of a kick in the backside and correcting what they're doing, but he wouldn't file reports on them because he was worried that in later years somebody might read the report and completely misunderstand what it was he'd been talking about. And then Kipling has this sort of mock German I tell you, this big brass hat business doesn't make the trees grow. And the modern version of that, I think, is I tell you, this performance review business, it doesn't make trees grow. The point of the exercise always is to grow better and better trees. It's not to performance manage people or to punish people. And that, building that in so that the system, the consequences regime, is helping people do a better job rather than scapegoating or, washing your hands of responsibility, which is so often the case. So I talk a lot about the architecture of accountability. These are 18th century, early 19th century prisons. There was a lot of work done on prison architecture, influenced by Bentham. So Bentham had put forward, I don't know how many of you know about Panopticon. Yeah. So he proposed that he would build a prison, which was going to be where the Tate Britain now is, which was going to be in a whole lot of places, but that's where they finally sort of settled on. Built out of steel, glass and concrete. And this is 1790 to 1800. And he was going to run it, which is why he thought a lot about incentives. And the logic behind it is that the prison administrator and his family could live in the core in the centre, and the prison administrator could see into all the different parts of the prison. But Bentham took it one further. He also then would have a viewing platform so the public could come in and see how the prison was being run, and they could then see how the prison manager was managing the prison. So the panoptic concept, if you like, is not only that the prison administrator could see into the prison, but that the system could see into the way the prison was being managed. And a lot of the sort of the origins of our thinking about public accountability go back to the sort of philosophy that Bentham developed. So this sort of question of architecture of accountability, is built into this conversation from a long time ago. As I said, did a lot of work on prisons when I was here, and I found a succession of reports from 1990 to 2000, when I was writing my report just after that, where they described basically a confetti of instructions, this sort of management by memo. And I in fact have seen private companies do the same. As the people in head office start to lay off risk or insure themselves against being blamed, they say, well, you can't, when they're called up before the Public Accounts Committee, public or private, you can say, well, you can't blame me for that because here's 5 memos I sent out that told them they had to do this. Well, of course, that's not a management system or an accountability system. That's a risk aversion system again. And so the movement to this architecture of accountability within the New South Wales prison system, so we wind up with, just taking a little bit further from what we talked about before, key performance indicators which have financial consequences, performance indicators which reputational consequences. There are human rights and legal obligations within a prison, and they have legal and professional implications. That's just simply a brute reality. That is the nature of a prison. And then we found there are the service standards that you've got to develop that have got to interface with all of those others, which is how we do things in our system. It's a system type of issue. And so we found ourselves dealing with, instead of just a bunch of memos sent out that have no priority or weight, we're not thinking about the load-bearing dimensions of what we're issuing. We're constructing a building, we're constructing an architecture with different things doing different work in different ways. And that sort of was an interesting difference between what we found ourselves doing compared with what had traditionally been done. You'll also find yourself in this interesting question of the role of the commissioner as opposed to senior management. When those two things are conflated, then you don't have to think about that. But if you have a commissioner, what responsibility, what intervention occurs by virtue of you being a commissioner, and what intervention should occur from management? And of course, if you intrude too deeply, you're taking responsibility and risk away from the people who can best manage that. So you've got to get that sort of balance is rather interesting. And then you've got to think about the sort of structural and cultural frameworks for performance monitoring. This sits within a bigger environment, and how's this actually working in practice? How does it relate to the way we did things in the past? So, consequences. Firstly, you need a range of different interventions. As I said, financial incentives, abatements, reputational incentives, the publication of results, governance incentives, earned autonomy or scaled intervention. So you earn autonomy in stages. I withdraw autonomy from you in stages. I don't just let off a nuclear bomb the first time I see something wrong. So you're able to grant greater autonomy or withdraw it. And then relational incentives. The fact is, as human beings, we are social beasts. And if what you've set through your contract boards or whatever other structures you've set up, you are out of favour or you're letting the team down, those sort of incentives can be hugely important if designed and worked well. Reward for success as well as intervention for failure. So reputational incentives you can have within the public sector. You can have performance awards and other forms of public recognition. You're actually quite good at that in this country. I mean, I don't know that it's structured and done as well as it could be, but I think you generally do it better in this country than we do in Australia. On the financial side, with rewards for success, in principle, you can have small financial rewards for the team. So they can have additional facilities at their prison, to take that example. It doesn't need to be a lot. It's a form of recognition. It's just that, that gym that we built because we got some additional funding that respected that gym then stands there in recognition of the fact that we did a great job. And then governance, you can earn autonomy, so that can work. Escalating interventions on the other side. So this is sort of based on what we're doing we've developed for the prison system in New South Wales. You have informal notification, so you basically let them know informally that they've got an issue, they need to attend to it. Enhanced support, so you might want to send them off for some training, you might want to put in somebody with some better skills into the team that the team seems to be missing. Formal audit and an improvement notice, formally documented meetings and a final notice, and then ultimately step in. An operational review, you might do an operational review, you might change your management. In extremis, you might just market test it and throw it open to the private sector to deliver. But there's an awful lot of things you can do before you need to think about that. But in the case of the New South Wales system, the current government has made it clear that they may do that eventually, but it's not their preferred position. And it was interesting talking to the Commissioner, who's had a lot of experience in the Australian prison system. I studied the prison system here more. Even with prison contracts, where you've got private companies providing, we actually discovered that informally, a whole lot of these earlier interventions had been done, both in the UK and Australia. I think consequences are central to commissioning. Devolution would not be responsible without meaningful accountability. And where you have a devolved system, it isn't going to work if you don't have meaningful accountability. Accountability will not serve as a management tool without a responsible consequences regime. It's just not a management tool, it's something else. And a consequences regime can't work if commissioners don't have choices. If you can't change the management team in some way, then it isn't a consequences regime. So that's sort of where we've got to on that. I mean, I have to tell you how it will work in practice will be another question. There's a lot of interest in treasuries across Australia in this and how it might work. And obviously creating headroom, creating space to do this within the system is a challenge, and that's part of the challenge that senior civil servants should take upon them in terms of creating the right environment for people to deliver.